panel each to respond to a question, and it may not be. I'll just wait and see what kind of answers answers I get. So Holly gave us an example of an environmental goal that you head towards rather than, well, now they do have a TMDL, but it started out as an environmental goal. And a lot of what the ports have to do is a regulatory role where you have to do it. And so how do we find a nice balance between voluntary measures and regulatory measures? So whoever wants to address that could take a shot at it.
I can start off with that. I think at least in Tampa Bay, the real critical thing to being able to have community support for a goal was to have that goal be meaningful to the community. And one of the first things that the estuary program did in 1990 was to ask the community what they wanted the bay to look like. And they said, well, we want clear water, we want better fishing, and we want to be able to swim without seaweed, is what they called it, which was the macroalgae. And so that all led to a seagrass goal that would help with that, and then the water quality requirements to meet that seagrass goal. So I think having a goal that is something that the community identifies as a voluntary goal is a real critical piece. And you know, in the case of Tampa Bay, it is now meeting a regulatory requirement also.
Just one example with the Port of Baltimore, we do have regulatory goals because if we're buying brownfields, we've got to clean them up. And a lot of times they're under consent orders or there's already some sort of legal action taken and we become part of that we're then responsible for that cleanup. But the one thing that we have recognized is because we are more of a business-oriented organization, is that in order to maintain the community buy-in, we have to collaborate with the communities. We have to go above and beyond other than just what the Maryland Department of Environment will have to request as far as a cleanup. So the Masonville example that we talked about, we met with the community and they said, yeah, we want you to clean this up. You've got creosote down there, you've got old ships, you've got a trash dump from the old 1906 fire that burnt down half of Baltimore. You know, get all that stuff out of there. And then they said, well, but we want to use the site, you know, adjacent to it. So if you clean that up, then we can create a park out of it. And so we just took that and said, okay, well, we did all the cleanup, all that we were required to, and said, well, we're gonna enhance the community. We had a 50-acre section next door that we cleaned it up and we created a park. We put a kayak launch, we put in a floating pier, we put in nature paths. We get bird watchers and it's very passive recreational opportunity. So, you know, by working with the collaborative effort with the communities to get them engaged, you know, we've had to step up and do that to maintain that community support.
Yeah, we've thought about this a lot. I think that one of the big things is to get the people who might potentially sue you on your team. And I think the way the partnership effort works, especially in the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, other regional partnerships, and our office, is we just try to make it available for everybody to be involved and help make the decision and give them that ability to be patient until something can positively occur as far in removing pollution sources and cleaning up pollution.
Okay.
Just one real quick add-on, because of our success at Masonville, we're looking at other properties to expand our dredge sites. We now have communities calling us and offering us property to say, look, will you come in and clean this up for us and get this done? And then there's maybe something that the port can do with them. So, through that collaborative effort, we've garnered a lot of support because they're seeing us as an agency that can come in and help and be part of the cleanup and the remediation that's needed.
So I have to ask, where are you taking all of this pollution?
Well, a lot of it goes back into our containment sites
Okay.
because we still have those containment sites, but we sequester them in those locations.
Okay. Do we have questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, Mike Perfett, University of Florida. A lot of Florida problems that aren't just in Tampa Bay. Wondering, so you talk about community support, but does the community reach into their pocket? I mean, I don't understand how that gets paid for, right? I understand why you'd want community support and why people probably would say, no, I want to leave it polluted, I mean, clearly they would, you'd think that most people would say, I'd like clean water, I'd like to clean up the pollution. But how does that get you to pay for it? Who pays for the park? Who pays for clean? How did you get people in Tampa Bay? How did you get the private industry to pay for it? Even if the public says they want it doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to reach into their pocket and pay for it.
I think from the Tampa Bay example, we found that if we asked the private sector, the industries especially, the electric utilities, to help meet this goal, that they have done that through a lot of different types of projects. But part of it was meeting regulatory requirements, and part of it was going above and beyond that. And it is, I think, it's part of being viewed as a partner rather than as an adversary, within the community that has made it very advantageous for members of the industries and the private sector to be a part of this nitrogen management consortium that's collectively, making some progress.
Is that good PR that they use?
It is, yes. We talk a lot about our partnerships, obviously, and about the success of this collaborative approach, and they're definitely part of the solution. Yeah.
And in our case, it's very much, we have transportation funding because there is a transportation link. We have access to our dedicated funds that come from gas tax and all those other things. That funds our Department of Transportation. So that's our source of funding. But what we've been able to do is by making those investments to get these things started, we now, we've been able to create partnerships with the Living Classrooms Foundation, the National Aquarium of Baltimore, Fish and Wildlife Service, Maryland Department of Natural Resources, so that, again, those partnerships, they're all investing now because they see the success and they see the opportunity. Fish and Wildlife is investing in it because Fish and Wildlife now has an initiative for urban wildlife refuges or urban wildlife areas. Our Masonville site was one of the first 10 in the country to be designated as that. So we're very proud of that. It's a new initiative, and now they're coming to the table saying, hey, this is a great idea, this is a great opportunity. It showcases our objectives while you're meeting yours. This is fantastic. We want to be a partner to this, and we're willing to invest.
One thing we saw during the oil spill especially was there was a huge pent-up volunteer demand that went kind of unmet. I mean, there was lots and lots of people who wanted to come out and do work and help out, but it wasn't a well-organized process to figure out what was the best way to use all that volunteer demand. And at a smaller scale, I mean, things like Alabama Water Watch, where these people are volunteering to do this stuff in their community, to go and do the water monitoring. They're using low-cost water monitoring tests, and they're voluntarily using their own time to go and work with their city and public officials to try to get some of these things fixed, which is a lot of times infrastructure issues, but targeting that infrastructure with their city and community officials.
Let me raise the question of, I can see Tampa Bay residents may be a little different from Detroit residents. Or with Baltimore, the people that they see the water, they see the results of the pollution. What about more long-distant sources of pollutants, for instance, atmospheric deposition or PCBs in the lower Hudson River that came from somewhere upstream, or the classic case in my repertoire is things that come from Kansas and cause pollution. And so the people who see, or not even see, you can't even see some of these pollution effects. How do you try to get that long distance public involved?
Can I jump on this one, Nancy?
Sure.
I come from Kansas. But when I talk about
Illinois,
when I talked about, we had steers growing up and all that kind of stuff. But when I talk to family farmers and people back in Oklahoma and Kansas especially, they don't want to feel like they're causing someone else not to be able to fish or not to be able to enjoy recreation on the Gulf of Mexico. They also go down, they like to go to the coast of Texas and play on the beach. So I think if you can bring it home to those kind of issues that they don't want their, my family's feeling, they don't want their actions to impede someone else's actions to have a job and prosper. I mean, I think that's the way that we explain it around Thanksgiving dinner table.
Could you enlarge your size of your table to include more of the populace within the Midwest and big agribusiness?
Oh no, agribusiness. Yeah, it's tougher with the big businesses, but I think when we start thinking about businesses as not being people, I think that's when we get into those kind of bigger issues, because they have people who work in the community, live in the community. Their executives work and live in the community a lot of times, and bringing it back to them for their children and their grandchildren, I think makes a big difference.
David, you must have to deal with, maybe not, I'm just suspecting this might be the case, conflicting regulations. And what do you do about conflicting regulations? Checking the audience.
Seeing who else here. We do have, because we deal with EPA, Corps of Engineers, we have state regulations, we have state policy. In Maryland, we actually just did a recent survey. We're one of the only states that has kind of a state-run dredge material management plan where we have to look at what we're going to do with dredge material. Most other ports deal with the Corps of Engineers for that service. And in Maryland, our legislature prohibited open water placement, which a lot of other communities, other ports still have. So that's why we have to find contained areas now. So we are constantly in a conflict with the Corps because the Corps says, well, that's your law, that's not ours. So it ends up costing us money because the way they establish their base plan is they're looking at the least cost, environmentally beneficial way to dispose of dredge material, and a lot of times that's open water placement. And we've got to kind of pick up the tab for the difference of that. So, one of the things in my other slideshow is a lot of our least cost opportunities have been exhausted. We're now getting into a lot more of the expensive one, and we've come to the realization that that's kind of how we're going to have to deal with it, and how we're going to have to deal with some of the issues that we're going to have.
Yes, Steve.
So, Steve Lorenz, University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. I just want to go back to a comment that Troy made in his remarks about the corn subsidies and and actually it relates to your comments as well. I'm not from Kansas. I was born there, though, and I actually have relatives who are farmers, and for them, it's not economically wise not to grow corn because they make money doing that. And so how do we get to the core of the problem, to try to change that incentive to make it more environmentally responsible practices as part of the norm?
Right. Well, one of the things is to pay for conservation rather than to pay for more corn. But the more corn is tied into the ethanol use, which then gets to the fertilizers. Anybody have a...
Well, doesn't the new Farm Bill try to deal with some of that with the crop insurance program a little bit to ensure that through that program now that there's some more conservation activities tied to having crop insurance? There's a start with that, I think.
Subsidies for insurance rather than to grow. But the Farm Bill, I'm actually surprised given the political reality that we're in right now with set debt ceilings and sequester and level budgets, that the people that want to reduce the budget aren't looking more closely at the subsidies in the Farm Bill because they're really, really high. But then there's also the food stamp program in there too, which, that's what they targeted. They didn't target the subsidies. And so it befuddles me in a situation where we want to save money for the country, how that unevenness can persist. But don't go there. Yes, Larry.
Thank you. Larry Mayer, University of New Hampshire. I want to follow up with Holly, and I sometimes tend to lean more towards the cynical side. And yes, of course, the population want to see a cleaner bay. And the private sector, you said, well, they want to be good corporate citizens and be part of. But isn't it really the fact that by taking part in this and collaborating, they had some more control over establishing the limits?
Yeah, so
And then I want to follow that up in a second.
The TMDL itself was established by EPA, but it was the goal that the estuary program had set earlier on. So there already had been buy-in by the local communities of that goal and the process of going back to seagrass and the science-based part of that. But the wish to participate, it really was that the local governments and the private industries wanted to be able to figure out how to divide up that set pie. And the regulatory agencies were willing to work with us rather than independently and provide exactly what the allocations would be. So it was a decision by the private industries and the local governments that they wanted to be able to divide up the pie.
Right.
Yeah.
And just to follow the cynicism a little further, have you tracked now, it's a wonderful success story, on an economic basis, what the impact of this recovery of the seagrasses has been in terms of dollar value for a range of ecosystem services?
Yeah, we're actually at the process now. We'll have a report done by an economic evaluation on not just the effects of the bay itself, but the economic valuation of a healthy bay. So what's the difference between having a body of water and having a body of water that can support the sort of ecosystem services and human services that that Tampa Bay now does. So that's a project that's underway right now, and we'll be reporting on that in about 6 months.
Despite the population level around that bay now, I would rather live there now than in the 1970s. So Don has a question.
Yeah, I'm gonna continue with Larry's cynicism and go back and try to see if I can force you to answer Nancy's first question. Can anyone give me an example of where a major pollution source has been significantly reduced simply by voluntary or even incentive-based programs as opposed to regulatory requirements?
I think, you know, in Tampa Bay that the TMDL came along in 1998. However, the regulatory element of the wastewater treatments started in 1980. So it was really a mixture between
The
regulatory.
TMDL guides the regulation.
That's right.
But
yeah.
without the regulation, why would the plants spend the money to do what they had to do?
Yeah. I think that that the regulation has been an incredibly important backstop to what we're trying to do in a voluntary way. But it's a very important backstop.
I see a question over here.
Hi, Clarence Flard, Sea Grant Fellow with National Marine Fisheries Service. We're talking about harboring pollution, and there were some lists of types of pollution. Though one type of pollution I didn't see on any of those lists. In some cases, it sort of is a point source, comes out of a pipe, and that's biological pollution, invasive species, which have huge impacts on the areas that we're talking about right now. 40% of the species listed under the Endangered Species Act are there in one way or another because of invasive species. So it's a huge issue. Just wondering what your policies are on that.
The Port of Baltimore, we fund some testing and some research and hopefully some implementation of ballast water issues. We work with Dr. Bosch. Yes, absolutely. Work with the University of Maryland, so they have done quite a bit of work on that. We've helped fund a barge and through some federal grants as well. Again, leveraging through those partnerships. We recognize that we're dealing with a lot of shippers. We're pretty far upstream. We're 135 miles from the ocean, so there's a concern that what's going to come in ballast water and on the ship's hull is going to end up staying in Baltimore and create some significant issues. So we've been working with the University of Maryland to try and identify some of those fouling agents, but also some techniques to try and address those. And Merck, the Maryland group, has been going to Norfolk and Baltimore and places in between to do a lot of testing and again kind of waiting on a lot of the Coast Guard regulations to be implemented, but they're well in front on this.
Right. Invasive species was on my multiple stressors list, but it wasn't on my pollutant list, so I can see a ballast water would come out of a pipe, but something coming off the hull of a ship would be very different. So, in fact, we don't know why we don't have more harmful algal blooms in Louisiana because of the nutrient input from the river, the major transportation that goes on there, and the warming of the water body over time. So we think we're sitting on a keg of dynamite there as well. So, any other questions? We had fewer speakers. I'm happy to take more questions. Our distinguished House of Representatives speaker is not here yet. Bob, would you like to guide us here?
Being a chemist by training and being male, the endocrine disruptor issue seems to be raising its head, and I'm just curious.
Would somebody please take the microphone?
Is anybody addressing that issue? I mean, is that a real problem? You read about it in the newspaper that it could be a problem, but there's nothing identified. I mean, there's nothing really. I haven't seen any quantification. That's point number one. Point number two, we all know that some of the metabolites of some of the pollutants are more of a problem, like the dioxins with respect to PCBs and other chlorinated hydrocarbons, tetrachloroethylene, et cetera. And so I'm curious about the metabolites as well, and any of the studies that any of you have done, because these two are new. We're only actually figuring out the basic chemistry of them, but I don't think we really know the effect, the full effect on them on a human population.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I know we do sediment chemistry and have looked at sediment contamination and potential risk assessments for both ecosystem and human health. But the endocrine disruptor has not been one that has surfaced in the Tampa Bay area as a major issue. It may be because we haven't looked at it, but it's not been one that has been identified to date.
I just keep thinking about it from how much money do we want to spend in public operated treatment works to solve the problem, because it's the pharmaceuticals are ubiquitous and they're in the wastewater and I mean, as far as reading, the alligator studies is the only ones I can think of that showed maybe the alligators had some sexual faults, I think, because of endocrine disruptor, but I can't remember what levels it was at. Was that Lake of Poplar's? Some in Florida, yeah.
Well, right here in the Potomac River.
Yeah, that's
There's the incidence of intersex fish.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It seems like the National Institute of Health would be interested in following some of these type of chemical pollutants, because there are both, they're definitely health concerns for people. Also, you might not know this, but in the Gulf of Mexico, in the area of hypoxia, fish that live closer to the hypoxic area, and don't you worry about it, because it's females that turn into males, which reduces, which would reduce the potential recruitment, and how that would reflect in fisheries landings is another issue. So, yes.
I'm Alexis Rudd from the Consortium for Ocean Leadership. I have a question. We've seen a theme of local solutions for global problems, and 90% of consumer goods travel on ships. And so I was wondering how international and national policy plays into the solutions that you're finding for local pollution.
Well, from the Port of Baltimore, a couple things. One, we're very engaged with marine spatial planning, a lot of the shipping routes. We do a lot of the invasive species that I talked about before, and we're following the United Nations Treaty on Sulfur Emissions. In fact, we had a cruise ship left the Port of Baltimore because they couldn't meet those sulfur emissions levels, so they pulled out of Baltimore. Later to realize, about 6 months later, they came back because they could implement some of the scrubbers in that. So they went to Tampa, then they came back. So those types of issues, those international issues, we're tracking, and really that's part of our air quality plan. Is we're looking at air sheds, but we're also looking at those potential sulfur emissions and what can we do as a local entity to do what we can on that front. And again, we deal internationally with a lot of things, but I'm more focused on the local side. But they're on our radar to address.
I think atmospheric deposition is something that really needs a at least regional, if not national or international approach, just because how we work with atmospheric deposition is we treat the stormwater, that comes off the land, that includes the atmospheric deposition piece. Our local electric utilities are implementing reductions. Primarily due to Clean Air Act requirements. but we have actually been able to track improvements in air quality and improvements in water quality that seem to track very well with some of the reductions from our local sources. But I think really a regional, at least regional, if not national, approach to air quality in emissions is really something that that's critical.
Yeah, because many of the atmospheric NOxes that come down in the Chesapeake Bay are actually generated in the Mississippi River watershed. So, you know, it's at least a U.S. problem, and it is global as well. Bob, have you? Okay, one.
Hey, Nancy, I was going to say one thing. Is it time?
Oh, yeah.
Oh. So when I know when I was working in the embassy in Bangkok last year, I mean, you know, they're diplomats, right? So when you get a scientist in there, they're really looking for the different solutions that we're already using, whether they're technology based or whether they're community based. And so some of the things we were able to bring overseas was things like community water monitoring, to be able to justify to their public officials that there was a problem in their community because they had the science to back it up. Where before, a lot of times it was protesting and you know, coming down to the Ministry of Natural Resources, you know, and protesting to say we have a problem. But now it's empowering those communities to be able to bring data that met QA.
There was a question back here.
Yes, this is a question for you, Nancy. Going back to excess nutrients, sure, we need to address it in agricultural lands and our policies and so forth. But what we've done essentially to our rivers and streams is channelize them and levee them off, so they're essentially pipelines to the ocean carrying nutrients. We've disconnected rivers from their floodplains and wetlands. Floodplains are critical for denitrifying nitrogen compounds and such. Do you think that restoring some of these floodplain functions may have an impact on reducing the nutrient loads into our coastal waters, causing hypoxia, as you know, harmful algal blooms and so forth?
Well, absolutely, but it's one of many management tools that can be used. I mean, some of the pipes, I mean, the runoff very often is in the agricultural lands because of piping, not channelization of the river. And the place to take care of it is closer to the source rather than at the mouth, because, believe me, the state of Louisiana would just as soon put those nutrients all over the wetlands. So there are lots of things that can be done. Managing the tile drains in the agricultural systems, making artificial wetlands or recovering not so productive farmland into wetlands and buffer strips. Those are all designed to allow nature some way to take up the nutrients rather than having some. It's going to take a combination of all of them, is my opinion. And if you look at, there's a federal state tribal task force that did a lot of studies in the early 1900s about the causes and the solutions of hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. And when you know the sources are primarily over 50% from corn and soybean fields, then that would show you a good place to target. That's not to ignore the many other things that you can do. So that's, I think that's one of the issues is a broad-based system for trying to make differences. Yes, Bob.
Larry Swanson from Stony Brook University. You commented on citizens monitoring programs, and I'm wondering, are citizens monitoring programs being used in the regulatory framework or to identify problems, or are citizen monitoring programs really more to make people feel good that they're actively involved?
Go ahead.
I know in some of the ones that we've funded, like in Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation, they actually provide their data back to the state of Louisiana, and it's been used to help remove waters from the impaired water bodies list, especially for things like bacteria.
I think you have to have a more affluent community to take on the water quality monitoring. People that have time to do it, whereas many of the people who are affected by the pollution are so busy working just to have a living that you're not going to get much participation from that group of people. So you have to have somewhat an affluent citizenry to help do that monitoring.
One thing we're very fortunate is that our drainages are all within, basically almost all in one country. So in a lot of ways it's on us to solve it. We don't have to worry about, so much people damming things up in other countries and like in the Mekong and stuff like that. It affect those multi-country problems.
I saw a hand go up over here.
Matt Lettrick with the National Science Foundation. It sounded like one of the most important things for these projects is community support. So in terms of engaging your community as it relates to pollution, what have you found to be some of the most effective ways of engaging that community?
I think it's one of the major parts of overall nutrient control is to engage the community. It's not easy to do, and it requires very consistent and persistent education or involvement. And getting back to one of the things we were talking about earlier, if you have a community that lives around the water body that you're trying to protect or restore, it's a lot easier than if they never see that watershed. So I think having a watershed that is more tightly contained around a bay or a stream is another important piece there to link them to that. But overall, trying to relate what people do in their backyards, for instance, with fertilizer or landscape practices, picking up after their pets, is one way to engage the community. But it's how effective that is. We're trying to evaluate that now with some fertilizer regulations that have been enacted in terms of lawn fertilizer in the Tampa Bay area. But bringing it to their level, either because they're fishing or swimming or enjoying the view, is a really important piece there. But it's not easy. So, yeah.
Yeah, for us, real quick, because we've got projects that are going to take 5, 10, 20 years to go through. We find the earlier we get engaged with the community, and we try to be as transparent as we can. I mean, we'll share the bad news with the good news, and say, look, this is bad news. How are we going to handle this? What do you think? So that it's a two-way communication. We're asking them for input as to the problems that we have, and we want to hear their thoughts and their solutions and their ideas. So having that, it's not only going to sit in a meeting and make a presentation, it's asking them, well, what do you think? How do you think we should handle this? Give us some ideas, and is this doable?
And I would just add that I think if they feel like if the community feels like that someone's going to listen to them and try to make a difference based on the efforts they're doing and the monitoring, volunteer monitoring, stuff like that, they're doing that. It's much easier to sell it.
I think education at many levels is at the root of finding better solutions for the future by all of society. So that, for instance, some of the issues in the Gulf, I've had agricultural interests out on our research vessel, the Pelican, to do a pseudo-hypoxia cruise. Or we've had shrimpers go up to meet, or they took me out into a cornfield and showed me what a tile drain looked like. Have you ever seen one? No. Well, get in the truck, we're going. So I say, get in the boat, we're going. So I think education is very important. I give many talks in the Midwest, and I've even several times conducted high school class lectures from our video conference to those individuals, and I always ask, this seems like a huge problem. What can you do as an individual? And I, it's high school, so there, not a whole lot of response. But so I say, okay, does your family fertilize the lawn? And yes, I said, well, do you have to cut it? Maybe you can talk to them about not putting so much fertilizer on. Or what did you have for lunch today? And if they said a half-pound sirloin burger, I'd say, well, maybe you should try something different that might not be so harmful to the environment. Or what did you drive to school today? Or did you walk to school? Did you ride your bike to school? Did you drive a fuel-efficient car? Did you drive a huge SUV that uses lots of fuel? So I try to bring it back to what that individual can do, but you have to be able to link what they're doing to the ultimate resource at risk. Yes.
Bob Carell. Nancy, you and Troy have raised an issue in my mind. Some years ago, USGS ran a study of a watershed out in the farmlands. I'm not sure whether it was in Kansas or quite where they measured all of the fertilizer put in and then monitored all the drain-off system and caught it before it left that watershed, and found that 50% was still unused when it left the watershed. So it raised issues about, and there was a lot of discussion about precision farming as a mechanism by which, one, you can manage that, two, you can manage the water better so you don't use as much, because as we know, 80 or 85% of the water that we use in this country goes into the agricultural area. And thirdly, they talked about what I would call landscape architecture. Now, how do you design that farm from a landscape architecture point of view? Where do you put the trails and so on? What's the status of that? Because I haven't looked at it recently, but it seemed to me those are the kind of management perspectives that you down at the Gulf might benefit from, things that are done up in Kansas.
Right. There are many best management practices that can be put into place. It's the scale at which they can be done. But the National Research Council has had several reports on Mississippi River water quality and the Clean Water Act. And one of the things they pushed for in there, I think it was their second report, was for some combination of EPA and USDA effort to make a difference and then monitor if there is a difference. And the USDA came out with their Mississippi River Basin Initiative. A lot of money when you look at it, not enough to go across the whole watershed, but putting in more of these, just try it and see how it works sort of projects. And the results of those are coming in now. Now, how to apply the results of those studies into an overall better farm management, like you're talking about, is still that political or social large step that we have to make.
And I think we're having better luck nowadays in getting farmers that are successful doing those kind of practices, telling other farmers, and instead of NRCS, Extension, EPA coming out trying to tell the farmers, they have other farmers telling them this, look, I'm saving this much money now.
I'll do it when my neighbor does it, and the neighbors are doing it now. So, yeah.
Yeah, my name's Aaron Longton. I just asked a question before without introducing myself. I'm from Port Orford. I just wanted to make a recommendation. There's a film called Ocean Frontiers. Some of you may have seen it. I know that it's going to be showing here in Washington, D.C. sometime in the next couple of weeks at some event. It deals with all these different topics that have been brought up today. And just one of the things specifically that it addresses is the hypoxia zone off the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi River, and how farmers in Iowa are engaging in a project where they have their harvest is guaranteed X amount of bushels per acre for corn, and then they start reducing the amount of nitrogen that they're putting on, and they're finding that the chemical companies are telling them that you need X amount of, to get this many bushels. They've reduced it by 50 cents. They're still getting the same type of yields. And it took a government program to guarantee their harvest level to get them to engage in that. And they're also doing all kinds of works with watershed, like you're saying, filters to filter their runoff.
Right. Thank you for that comment. I'd like to thank the panel for their participation.